Good evening. Welcome to the history of the modern Palestinian problem. If this is not the class you signed up for, then you want to go to that class. But let us pray, and we're going to get started. So, Lord, thank you so much for this opportunity to understand more about what is happening today in the Middle East and how we got to this point. So, Lord, I pray that it would cause us also to understand how you have laid your hand on the people that you call your own, and that it would cause us to be people that pray for Israel, and the blessings be upon that people. Lord, that they would receive their Messiah is our highest prayer for them. We know that they will one day, but we pray for every individual person who calls himself a Jew, that he would open his eyes to understand that the Messiah is the one that you sent those years before, and that they would find salvation in him. Lord, we thank you for this class. We thank you for everyone who's been part of it tonight, and we ask your blessing over this time. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, welcome, and glad you're here. Also, we want to welcome those that are with us through live streaming, and so can we all just, say welcome to those that are home watching us live streaming. Awesome. So what we're going to do, we're going to go through the history. First of all, just a brief history of Israel, starting with the time of Jesus, and just moving very quickly through the centuries, bringing us up to more modern times, talking about, of course, the Palestinian problem. How did we get the Palestinian problem? And what I mean by that is the refugees that are considered Palestinian refugees. How did we get there? Because that really is the lightning rod of a lot of the conflict in the Middle East, although it's certainly not all of it. Also, I want to try to reserve some time at the end for questions. So feel free to start kind of writing down questions that kind of jog in your mind as we go through, and then we'll try to answer as many questions as we can at the end of the class. All right, so let's begin. Of course, when Jesus was nearing the end of his ministry, he gave a prophecy that temple in Jerusalem would be destroyed, no stone left upon another, such the destruction would be. And if you remember, Jesus, when he came down the Mount of Olives and he looked out over Jerusalem, he wept. And in fact, when you go to Israel, and I hope that you have the opportunity, this is one of the first things that we do. We go there in the morning because the sun shines upon Israel, of course, in the morning. And when you go down the Mount of Olives and you pause in that place and you see Jerusalem laid out before you, you can just sense the burden that Jesus felt when he looked over that city, because that city had not received their Messiah. And he wept, and the scripture describes it as a bitter weeping. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how I've longed to gather you, as a hen would gather her chicks under her wing. But you would not have it. Behold, your city is laid to you desolate, for you did not know the time of your visitation. Because God had sent the long-awaited Messiah, and they rejected their Messiah. And so he's prophesying of the city's destruction and the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, which of course we know. Then after that, let's roll forward. There was another revolt, actually, a short time after that. And so in 131 AD, the Roman Emperor Hadrian actually took again after the second Jewish revolt, and this time he renamed Jerusalem. And this time his response was very harsh. Well, it was harsh the first time, but now very harsh. Renamed Jerusalem and constructed a temple to Jupiter on the Temple Mount. And so the Jews then were banned from living in Jerusalem itself. No Jews were allowed to live in Jerusalem. And that ban persisted until the Arab conquest And so then it was 131, Emperor Hadrian renamed that area Palestine, no longer wanting it to be called Israel. And why would he use the name Palestine? Well, because they wanted a name that would offend the Jews. And so they named it after their mortal enemies, the Philistines. Thus, it's called Palestine today, named after the mortal enemy, the Philistines. Now, that's important to recognize because sometimes when people think Palestinian, they think, oh, it must be like an ethnic heritage. What is Palestinian? It must be, ethnic. No, Palestinian is not ethnic. Okay, the quote Palestinians are Arabs. And in fact, the Jews called themselves Palestinian Jews because it's just a reference to the area. And so it's important to recognize how we got the name Palestine on the area. Then, shortly after that, there was another major revolt against the Romans, and they threw off Rome for a short time. And they renamed it Jerusalem. And then, because the Christians refused to participate in this revolt, this was the final straw, you might say, and the Jews no longer considered Christians having anything to do with Judaism. So there was a big separation between Christianity and Judaism, because before that, Christianity was considered a sect of Judaism up to that point. So that's important to recognize, a great division. Then we move forward a bit, and you remember, of course, that the Roman Empire then became divided. And it was divided between the West and the East. In the West, the head of the Western Roman Empire was still Rome. And in the East, then it was Constantinople, named after, of course, the famous Emperor Constantine. And later it became known as the Byzantine Empire. And so they ruled that area. The Eastern Romans, the Byzantine Empire, ruled that area from, let's say, 325 or so to 636 AD. So about the 4th century, Constantinople became the capital of the East. Christianity then was adopted as the official religion of the Eastern Roman Empire. And the name Jerusalem was restored again, and it was deemed to be a Christian city. So that's very interesting in its history. Jews were still banned. Under Constantine, Jews were still banned from living in Jerusalem. They were allowed to visit. And it was during this time when the Jews would come to visit that the Western Wall became sacred. And when you go to Israel today, going to the Western Wall, which is where they pray, and they put their prayers on little pieces of paper and insert them into the cracks of the rocks, is one of the, you must go there, right? It's just an experience to go. And every time we go to Israel, we go there. It's called the Kotel, the K-O-T-E-L, the Kotel. And you go there, and the women are separated on one side from the men. And but you can go, you pray, and you put the men put a covering over their head because they're outdoors, and then they go and they pray. No, that is required by law. And so then let's move forward to the 5th century. The Western Roman Empire now collapses. And then what happens, because it's important to our story, is that it led to a Christian migration. So the Christians now are migrating out of the Western Roman Empire, and so many of them moved to the area of Palestine, thus making it a Christian majority. Population, mostly Christians during the 5th century. Then, now we roll to the 600s. So again, I'm running through history fast here. In 611, Persia invaded the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. And after a long siege, they captured Jerusalem with Jewish help. Then the Jews were left there by the Persians to govern Jerusalem until 617, when the Persians then took over. So then from 636 to 1096 then, let's say that 400 and some years, 450 years or so, then the Arabs began to rule in that area. Now, according to Muslim tradition, and this is important to remember to understand what's happening in Islam in the world today. In Muslim tradition, in 620 AD, Muhammad flew from Mecca to the farthest mosque, whose location is considered to be the Temple Mount. Returning, flying the same night. And then, in that period, this is when 634, 636, the Arabs conquered Palestine. That ended, therefore, that Byzantine ban on Jews, because the Muslim leaders actually allowed the Jews to move back. And Islam then replaced Christianity as the dominant religion of that region. All right, now we move forward to the Crusades. This is important to recognize now the influence of Europe. So Palestine was ruled by various Arab rulers, during that 450 some years. It was during that time that the Dome of the Rock was built. And so when you go to Jerusalem, you go down the Mount of Olives and you see Jerusalem and you look at the Temple Mount, there is a golden domed building that is just brilliant in the light, and that is the Dome of the Rock. And it is actually a shrine. It's not a mosque. And so that was constructed between 685, 705. And then on the Temple Mount, next to the Shrine of the Rock, to the south of it, is a mosque. And it's called the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And so when the Muslim people want a place to go to worship and have a mosque, that is where they go, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So that is very, very important, because that, of course, is sacred to Islam, and a lot of political upheaval happens, of course, because Israel controls all of that. Now, that is, of course, deemed to be for Islam, but Israel controls the security. Now, we're going to get to how all that developed, but that is its origin, back when it was, 685, 705, the Dome of the Rock, the Al-Aqsa Mosque were built then. Now, let's go talk about the Crusaders, because the Crusaders are really important to this. Crusaders took Jerusalem in 1099 AD and ruled it until the 13th century. And so during the Crusades, both Muslims and Jews in Palestine were indiscriminately massacred or sold into slavery. And so the Crusaders were not nice, as you might understand from your history. Indiscriminate massacre, sold into slavery. And the murder of Jews began during the Crusaders' travels from Europe. So they started out in Western Europe. And as they're traveling out of Western Europe, they're heading towards Constantinople first, and then they're going to march down to Jerusalem. As they're marching across Europe, they're actually bringing persecution against the Jews as they go. Tremendous persecution in Germany, for example. And then they finally arrived in Constantinople, and then the army, about 30,000 or so, marched southward. So what had happened, the reason for the Crusades was that the Arab-Muslim rule and their attacking of the Byzantines was such that famous stories, infamous stories, started to come out about how the Christians were horribly treated by the Muslims. And so word of this began to spread, and the emperor of the Byzantine Empire, of Constantinople, called for help. Like, let's arise against this. The Christians are being, mistreated terribly by the Muslims. We must arise to do something. So this was the beginning of the crusade. So the Pope at the time, who was Pope Urban II, he called for an uprising. And so they put together 30,000 different soldiers, and the stated goal of the crusade was to recapture the Holy Land to ensure the safety for Christian pilgrims that wanted to come to Jerusalem and visit the sacred holy sites. And so this was their stated goal. But many of the Crusaders thought that this would be a perfect opportunity to serve God and simultaneously make a fortune in looting and ransom. So this large army in 1096, almost 30,000 men, prepared for battle. They marched from southern France to Constantinople. Immediately, by the way, friction arises with the Byzantines because they're not prepared for 30,000 Christians. And then they start to march down towards Jerusalem, and Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders in 1099. And again, the goal of the crusade was to ensure the safety, free passage of these pilgrims to have access to their sacred holy sites. And in celebration of that victory, the Crusaders ruthlessly slaughtered all of the Muslim inhabitants of the city of Jerusalem. And then the Jewish community in Palestine was forced to surrender, of course, to these new rulers or face execution. All right, so that was that rule during that period of time. Now we move forward in time to the Egyptian rule. I mean, that area has been attacked and ruled by so many different groups. So we call that the Mamluk rule from 13th century through 1517. An Egyptian sultan conquered Palestine during this time and ruled it until 1517. And the Jews during that time, right, were banned from worshiping at the Cave of the Patriarchs. And we've been going through in our study in Genesis, we know that Abraham and Sarah and Isaac were buried in that cave that Abraham bought, from the Canaanites. And he buried his wife there. He was buried there. His son was buried there. Rachel was not buried there, by the way. She was buried up near Bethlehem. But that became a sacred site. And the Jews were prevented from visiting this site by the Crusaders. And so this then became an open opportunity. The Jews were excited about that. The collapse of the crusade was followed then by increased persecution and expulsion of the Jews in Europe. So now the Crusaders are bringing back with them in their defeat a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism. And expulsions began throughout Europe against the Jews. And this became famous as now the rise of anti-Semitism becomes a big part of what's happening in Europe. Expulsions of Jews, England, followed by France. In Spain, famous expulsion of Jews, persecution including massacres and forced conversions. Many Jews were forced to convert to Catholicism, for example, during that time. And during the Black Death, many Jews were killed, murdered, because they were accused of poisoning the wells. They assumed that the people were dying from drinking poisoned water, and they accused the Jews, of course, of poisoning the water. And one of the reasons why the Jews were accused during the Black Death is because the Black Death did not seem to affect the Jews. Because the Jews would, live in enclaves, they would live in ghettos or different areas, and they were not being affected by Black Death. Now you might wonder, why is that? Why were the Jews not affected that other people were affected? And the answer is, of course, now we know that the Black Death is passed through rats. Actually, it's passed through fleas that are on rats. And then, of course, those fleas get onto people, and then they get Black Death. But a rat is a very unholy, dirty animal, and Jews want nothing to do with rats. Okay, so the Jews would make sure that there were no rats in their communities, and thus they had no Black Death. So the Europeans said, this is the most interesting thing. How is it that the Jews are not dying from this Black Death? They have to be part of it. They must be, a conspiracy theory arises, they must be the cause of this. So they came up with different suspicions of how they were causing the Black Death. One was poisoning wells. By the way, there have been many lies that have been perpetrated against the Jews. And one of those lies, of course, is Black Death, blaming them for it. Another lie is called blood libel. If you've never heard of this, it's important to kind of keep in your mind. In Europe, during this kind of middle centuries time, when there was a tremendous lack of education in the general population, it was very easy, let's say, to put forth rumors. And these rumors would catch hold and people would spread them quite quickly. And it was rumored that the Jews were stealing children and draining them of their blood and then using the blood in preparing their Passover crackers, you might say, the bread, the unleavened bread. Now, this lie, because of a lack of education and the fear and the emotion, of it, just caused it to spread. And people would rise up in mobs against the Jews. If a child was missing, the Jews must be part of that. And so then tremendous persecution. And then all it took after that was just to make the accusation. And a mob would rise up against a Jew on blood libel. Now, the crazy thing about blood libel, if you know anything about the Jewish law, is that, no, that's actually not lawful to eat anything with blood in it. And so the animals, it's just like the law. You cannot eat anything with blood in it. It must be thoroughly drained and, et cetera, et cetera. Because why? Because the blood is the life of an animal. And, of course, it all points to the sacredness of the blood of Jesus Christ. That's the idea, right? And so this blood libel was all part of the anti-Semitism that's now on the rise, prejudice against Jewishness, and Jews being forced to convert to either Catholicism or Christianity. And even if they did convert, then there would be prejudice against those that converted persistently. And so many Jews started to leave Europe. Many of them went to the New World. Many of them moved, especially the Spanish Jews, when they were fleeing, went to North Africa. A large population went to Poland. And in fact, as we know, a tremendous large population was in Germany. And many of them moved to the Ottoman Empire, which we'll talk about here in a minute. And many of them moved to Israel. And in Italy, during this time, they would put their Jews in ghettos. The idea of a ghetto, in America, we have an understanding of what a ghetto is, but it actually comes from the persecution of Jews. A ghetto was where they would force the Jews to live. And then they would restrict them from having any kind of career in, law or business or banking, or they would prevent them from being doctors, for example. All right, now we move to what's known as the Ottoman Empire. This is very important for us because now we're up to the about 1516 or so until 1917. So about 400 years, the Ottoman or Turkish or Turks. So the area of Turkey, right? Where does the name Turkey come from? It doesn't come from the bird. It comes from that they were Turks. And so this is important, the Ottoman Rule. It's conquered by a Turkish sultan, 1500, 16, 17, and it became a province of Syria, which is just north of that, for 4 centuries. And this was then in an uprising in the Ukraine, against this, 100,000 Jews were massacred, leading to another migration to Israel. Persecution arising in various places, causing migration to Israel. And interestingly, in 1844, and this is important to recognize, the Jews, by 1844, the Jews constituted the largest population group in Jerusalem. And by 1890, became the absolute majority of Jerusalem as a whole. And but when you take a look at the whole area of Palestine, the Jews only made up about 10% of the population. But Jerusalem, absolute majority. Now that's important today because of what's happening in the news, that East Jerusalem, they say, the Palestinian Arabs claim to be their capital if they are to have a Palestinian state. East Jerusalem, they claim, should be their capital because, after all, they've lived there many years. Let's go back again to 1850s to 1890s. Absolute majority was Jewish in that period of time. Now let's talk about, by the way, when we talk about the Ottoman Empire, because they're going to play into this story a lot, and again, they're Turks. They are not Arabs. Okay, so that area was not controlled by Arabs at all for that whole 400 years. Because this is important, because we have to go back. Is there a right? Is there a claim? Is there a legal claim to that land? And the Turks, through the Ottoman Empire, ruled they were not Arab. That's important. They were Muslim, but they were not Arab. Now let's talk about a wave of desire that arose in many Jews to have a homeland. And that wave of desire to have a homeland in Israel, in that area, is called Zionism. If you ever heard the phrase Zionism, it refers to that desire. So if you're a Zionist, then you're a person who believes that the Jews should have a homeland, and that homeland should be in Israel, or in that land we know today as Israel. That's a Zionist. And the Zionist movement came out of the anti-Semitism that arose in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe. So it's interesting because when you look at Western Europe and Eastern Europe, and I suppose I should do it the other way since you're looking at it that way, Western Europe and Eastern Europe, that there were different times of persecutions arising. So, for example, during the Enlightenment period, right, Europe led the Jews into enlightenment of their own, and it created emancipation. Like in Western Europe here, like now there's freedom for the Jews. And in fact, in 1791, the French Revolution led to France granting Jews legal equality, civil rights, for the first time in all of history. Like these are like, wow, these are some amazing, monumental progress, for Jews. And then the Napoleon Empire, it spread because Napoleon believed in giving the Jews these rights. It began to spread equal rights for Jews across Europe, Western Europe. And then Britain, they gave equal rights to Jews in 1856, Germany in 1871. So here we see in Western Europe, this is a tremendous rise of wonderful things. But at the same time, in Eastern Europe, there's a rise of persecution that's going on. The Russian czars and the Orthodox Church found that they were having problems in the eastern side of Europe, and it was very easy to blame the Jews. Conspiracy theories began to be very easy to perpetrate because it's easier to blame the Jews because it took the pressure off of the czars. And by the way, just a little side note, because the Russian Orthodox Church became so powerful, where did the Russian Orthodox Church come from? It actually came from Constantinople. Constantinople was the head of the Eastern Roman Empire, and it became a Christian center, as we know. And that religion became the Orthodox, Christian Orthodox. Later we call it the Greek Orthodox. All came out of Constantinople. Well, when the Turks overran it and defeated it, then, of course, the church must flee, and they fled north to Moscow, setting up the Russian Orthodox Church. So they're all related. So when you think of Orthodox churches, whether they're Russian or Greek, they're all related. They all come from the same thing. But now there's a rise of persecution, and the Orthodox Church is part of it. They're putting forth these rumors against the Jews. And in the 19th century, the greatest population of Jews in Eastern Europe lived within the Russian Empire. And Jews were actually banned from Russia during the 1790s, but as the Russian Empire began to expand and grow, they began to find that they're now expanding into areas where there are many Jews living. And so they began tremendous persecution against them. The Orthodox Church sought to benefit from setting up the Jews as the enemy. And the government then started these terrible pogroms against the Jews. The persecution against them was terrible in the East, and thus leading to a great migration. Jews fleeing in mass out of Eastern Europe, many of them fleeing to the United States. Some fleeing to Palestine, adding to the population there. And then it was during this time that Jews began to think, is it possible that we could have a homeland again? And so these Jews that began to migrate to the area of Palestine started to dream dreams, you might say. Now here's the problem. The problem is that it's controlled by the Turks, right, at this point. Yet they have this desire. And so they came up with an idea. What if we were to buy the land? Now, you're not going to buy the whole of Israel. Although it's interesting because you might say they tried. And this is what happened. So as the desire for Zionism, the idea of having a homeland, started to arise, then leadership started to arise to lead that movement. And in fact, in 1896, a very famous Jewish man named Theodor Herzl, he wrote a book, and it was named Der Judenstaat. It means the Jewish state, and it was German. And when he wrote that book, and in fact, he was sitting at home waiting for cases to arrive from the publisher. And when the cases arrived, he sat them in his living room, and he had his hands on them, and he said to his wife, "My life will be forever changed by these books." Because once they started going out to the bookstores, then not only did it start to stir something in Jews, it started to also stir alarm in many others. And so it changed the whole idea of what was happening in many Jews, the idea, maybe we can have a homeland. It gave rise to further anti-Semitism now in Europe. And in 1897, then Theodor Herzl established what became known as the Zionist Organization. This is the organization that's now going to lead this movement of making a homeland for Israel. And so they went to the Turks. The Zionist organization leaders, Theodor Herzl and Chaim Weizmann, amongst others, went to the Turks to try to negotiate. And they kind of put on airs a bit. They tried to make it look like they had access to a lot of money. And they suggested that they could arrange for massive loans to the Turkish government of the Ottoman Empire in exchange for having Palestine be given to them. Now, it was bodacious, and the Turks saw through it. They realized that they didn't have that kind of money. But they continued to negotiate and thought that these Jews could be useful to them. And so they allowed the Jews to, however, purchase small communities, acre at a time, hectare at a time. And so the Jews came up with this idea. What if we were to buy land from the Arabs, and we will build little communities? And so they started a kibbutz. You know what a kibbutz, right, is like a community living in like a farm, like a socialist farm. Everybody's for one another. Everybody owns it together, and everybody works, and the idea started to come together. And so Jews then started to go around the world raising money. And in fact, Golda Meir was part of the going around the world raising money from Jews. New York City, Chicago, the centers of finance in Europe, and trying to raise money. And they raised, of course, in their minds, not nearly enough, but they raised many millions of dollars. And they started to buy swamps, and you can buy swamps pretty cheap, you know. But they could drain the swamps and began to build agricultural centers, and they started to build schools, and they started to build some industry. And so now waves of Jewish immigrants started to come, and they're called Aliyah. So a Jew that is migrating to Israel to live there is making Aliyah. But they came in waves, and so they kind of named them the first Aliyah, the second Aliyah, the third one, etc. So in early 1900s now, the first 40,000 Jews settled in Palestine. The Zionist organization sets up a bureau in Palestine to adopt a new settlement policy and to issue money to those that are coming in. And they established the Gania, which is the very first kibbutz. All right, then that brings us now to the concern of the Arabs. Because the Arabs were concerned. They're seeing now waves of Jewish immigration. And so they tried to, stir up the Turks to prevent it. And the Turks did somewhat try to restrict it. But nevertheless, it continued. The Arabs are growing greater and greater concern. Meanwhile, the Jews are getting more and more money and buying more and more land. By the way, are you familiar with the Rothschild name? The Rothschilds are perhaps, some suggest that they're like the wealthiest. I'm sure the Arabs are more wealthy, but they're one of the wealthiest families in the world. And they're Jewish. And how they came upon their money, by the way, is an interesting story itself. We're going into a side little story. And that is that back in the days of European kings, money was considered dirty. Well, actually, in those days, money was dirty. Literally was dirty, because people would handle their money and they have dirty hands, and so it would become dirty. And so kings wanted nothing to do with money, and so they would hire then others to manage their money. Thus, the father, Rothschild, was hired, I think, by the Bavarian king to handle his money. When Mr. Rothschild had many sons, and those sons grew up to be adults, then he put his sons in different major cities in Europe: London, Amsterdam, Paris, Rome. And thus, these Rothschild sons began to, of course, set up banking centers with their father, and thus the first international banking system. And kings from all over Europe would utilize the Rothschilds for handling their funds. They became so successful that they would loan whole countries money. And they began to even have the power to manipulate currencies. And they developed tremendous wealth. And by the way, when it came to donating money for the establishment and the buying of land, they did not offer very much. But nevertheless, they became influential. All right, now we run to World War I. And in World War I, you might know that most of the Jews during World War I actually supported the Germans. Many of the Jews were divided on this, but many of the Jews supported the Germans because they were fighting the Russians. And the Russians was the center of, they're over here, aren't they? Russians were like the center of persecution. And so many of the Jews were for Germans because they were fighting against Russia. And there were others, however, other Jews believed that no, it was more advisable to align themselves with the West, with Britain. And Jewish leaders of the Zionist organization, namely Chaim Weizmann, began to influence British leaders who were already sympathetic to the aims of Zionism, including the Prime Minister, who was famous, Lloyd George. And so in 1917, this is a very famous year, 1917, very, very famous year. the same year as the Bolshevik Revolution that was happening in Russia. The British Army, including the Jewish Legion, drove the Turks out of Palestine. And it was during this time that the British foreign minister, his name is Lord Balfour. Now this is very famous, so you should lock this in your mind. Lord Balfour, he wrote a letter to Lord Rothschild. And that letter became subsequently known as the Balfour Declaration of 1917. And it stated that the British government viewed with favor, I'm just quoting from it, viewed with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. And of course, the Jews celebrated this declaration. That British support of Israel will become very, very important in the next years. Now, so the British then forced out the Turks. So then the British are controlling the area. The British Army is controlling the area, which we know as Palestine. And so during that time, there was an organization called the League of Nations. Anybody ever heard of the League of Nations? It actually was the organization that was before the United Nations. And the League of Nations had come together, of course, in the hopes of establishing peace. They essentially gave authority to the British to rule this area, and it became known as the British Mandate. And the boundaries of Palestine then were drawn. And in that time, the British included what we know today as modern-day Jordan, actually was included in Palestine. Now later, Winston Churchill set that aside as a separate country, which we know today as Jordan. United States, by the way, was not part of the League of Nations. Nevertheless, they endorsed the idea and the terms of the British Mandate, and they supported the British controlling the area. Now, that British Mandate is really, really important. We go from Ottoman Turkish rule to now British rule, that British Mandate. The British permitted the Jewish agency to oversee Jewish immigration and these land purchases from the local Arabs. And they're soon operating as an arm of the Zionist organization. They ran schools and hospitals, and later they formed a militia, very famous, called the Haganah. We'll get to them later. And then Chaim Weizmann, we remember him in England, he became the leader of the Zionist organization when Herzl died. And it began to distribute entry permits and funds donated from Jews around the world, established the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, 1925, the Technion University in Haifa. And then during this whole interwar period, the British, you might say, kind of in some way favored the Jews, but found themselves in a place of tremendous difficulty. And so they rejected the principle of majority rule because the Arabs clearly had the majority. So they rejected the principle of majority rule or any measure that would give the Arab majority control over the governing of Palestine. During this time, now, more waves of Jews come. The third Aliyah, 40,000 more Jews arriving in Palestine, trying to escape all the post-revolutionary chaos. The Bolshevik Revolution is just chaotic. 40,000 more come out of Russia. And many of these became pioneers, experienced, trained in agriculture, and the Jezreel Valley, which we know as the Valley of Megiddo, became just blooming with production and orchards and fields. And this, however, this great success of the Jewish immigration led to Arab rioting, Arab revolting. 1920 to 1921 was famous. Many people were killed by the Arabs as they're rising against this. So therefore, the British, trying to maintain some kind of balance, started making quotas, cutting off immigration of Jews. But the Arabs continued to attack these Jewish settlements, the kibbutzim. And the failure of the British to protect them led to the Haganah taking defense upon themselves. What would happen would be this. The Arabs would form a little attacking militia, and they would come to attack a kibbutz at night. Now, theoretically, the British control this. They're supposed to be policing this whole thing. So the British would form the Arabs would form a little militia and attack a kibbutz at night. And then in the morning light, the British would come streaming in, and there were no Arabs because they had disappeared. And so night after night, the Arabs would form a little militia. They would attack another kibbutz, and then by morning, they would disappear. And the Jews, enough. And so they formed a militia of their own called the Haganah. And so when the Arabs would come in at night, there would be the Haganah to counterattack them at night. These little skirmishes and battles happened at night. And then when the British would come to sort it all out, they'd all be gone. And this would continue on year after year as the tensions became greater and greater, and the rioting continued. Another wave of 90,000 between 1924 and 1929. 82,000 more arrived, fleeing anti-Semitism now. That's arising in Europe and Poland and Hungary. And the United States policy, by the way, was to not allow Jews to come in. And thus, Palestine was the dream. 80,000 more come. And in spite of all the increased persecution of European Jews in the 1930s, the British would do nothing to protect them in these little actions. And so wave upon wave of Jewish immigration, with the arising of these fascist regimes in Europe, depriving the Jews of their civil rights, their economic rights, persecution against them. They became non-citizens. Nazi rule became greater and greater. The Allies caused the Jews, Nazi allies caused the Jews to want to flee in greater numbers. 250,000 more arrived in the fifth Aliyah, and after which the British decided to create a blockade. This is all during the heavy persecution in Europe. But many tried to come in, doctors, lawyers, professionals. In fact, it's interesting, the Nazi government actually allowed 50,000 Jews to arise and to leave. Of course, they had to pay for that. But they left. And bringing out of Europe doctors and lawyers and professionals, causing the economy in Palestine now to flourish. And as you can just imagine, this is causing the Arabs to increasingly get anxious about this. And so the Jews were now forced to illegally, because of the heavy persecution arising now by Nazism, they must resort to illegal immigration. British has a blockade, but they come in secretly. Sometimes by Syria, but normally secretly trying to come in by boats. This led to large-scale Arab revolt in the late 1930s. Finally, the British put together what's called famously a Peel Commission. It was led by Commissioner Peel, who was trying to put together a solution. And this commission recommended that the area be partitioned, that there be an area exclusively for Jewish territory, exclusively Jewish, in Galilee and along the western coast. Jewish opinion was divided on this idea. The Arab leadership abandoned it, rejected it outright, and so it never got any traction. But later, the Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, said, if that Peel Commission had been successful, 6 million Jews would have survived because they would have been allowed to come to Israel. But Jews were divided on it, and Arabs completely rejected it because the Jews would have been given Galilee and the Western Strip, and all the rest of it was going to be given to the Arabs, and they refused it. Instead, they rioted. So then, in response to the riots, then they put together another commission. They loved commissions. And they put together what's called famously as the White Paper of 1939. And that white paper stated that now, with almost 500,000 Jews now arriving in Palestine, the Balfour Declaration had achieved its goals. You can see they're getting ready to wipe their hands of this. It had achieved its goals of a national home for the Jewish people, and it recommended, therefore, an independent Palestinian government governed jointly. We're going to have joint, this is their idea, it never flew, the idea of having them govern together, side by side, in the same cabinets, in the same, parliament. Both the Jews and the Arab leadership rejected this idea. So the response was to ban Jews from purchasing land. The British were now starting to take a heavy hand. They're turning, they're changing. Now a heavy hand comes against them. They won't allow the Jews to purchase land in like 95% of Palestine. Then comes World War II and the Holocaust. During World War II, interestingly, the Jewish Agency wanted and tried to establish a Jewish army that would fight right alongside the British forces. And Churchill supported this idea, but he could not convince the British military or the other government leaders. So it led to its rejection. However, at the same time, there was a pro-Nazi uprising in Iraq. The Arab nations were pro-Nazi. And later, Iraq joined the Nazi effort. However, the British refused to allow the Jews in Palestine to have arms. As now Rommel's forces are now in North Africa making straight headway towards Palestine, intent on taking it and thus bringing the Holocaust right into the home of Palestine. But they refused to offer them arms to support them. Meanwhile, individual Jews would just simply sign up to serve in the army. Because remember, the Jewish Agency wanted to have a Jewish army, and that was what was rejected. But the Jews individually could join an army. And so the Jews did. And in fact, many Jews died fighting the Germans. 200,000 Jews died. Now, this is an interesting factoid. 200,000 Jews died fighting in the Soviet army because the Soviets were fighting against fascist Nazism. 1943, the Soviet Union released a famous Zionist leader, Menachem Begin. Now, some of you in history might know Menachem Begin was famous because he was intent, he later became prime minister, but he was intent on bringing conflict to the British. It's time to throw them off. And so he was intent on now armed conflict with the British. We're going to throw them off with armed conflict. Meanwhile, the Holocaust. The Holocaust had an overwhelmingly decisive impact on the Jews, as you can imagine, Jewish world and beyond. After the war, after World War II, the British Empire now is severely weakened, as you know, by the war. And then so the war in the Middle East, the war had caused the factors of the Middle East to be such that the British were very conscious of their dependence on Arab oil. And they became much more leaning towards cordial relations with the Arabs rather than helping the Jewish people establish a homeland. Meanwhile, they had this blockade that continued even after the war. So here, all of these Jews who had suffered the persecution of the Holocaust are not allowed to enter. A blockade is preventing them. Illegal immigration became the main form of Jewish entry into Palestine. Jewish Holocaust survivors are smuggled in. Small boats, trying to breach the blockade in any way they can. Meanwhile, Jews from Arab countries tried to flee, moving into Palestine overland. 110,000 Jews secretly secretly entered into Palestine. Now, at this point, in an attempt to win independence, Zionists waged a guerrilla war against the British. And the British are getting ready to they want out. They just want out. It's just too much. And so in 1946, following some Jewish sabotage, after the British arrested 2,700 Jews, including all the leadership of the Jewish agency, like this is going to not end well if something doesn't happen. So they appealed to now the United Nations. Help us solve this problem. In fact, what they did was they announced to the United Nations that upon a certain date, they're just going to be done. Like they handed it to the United Nations and said, if you don't solve it by such and such a date, I think it was May 15th of 1948, then we're done. We're just leaving. And so the pressure was on the United Nations to come up with some kind of solution. And so the United Nations came up with a solution. And that was the partition of Palestine. And interestingly, the Soviet Union was pushing this for their own particular reasons. But they were pushing this. In fact, it was that Soviet Union support that's what brought the partition to the successful vote. And I forgot the vote, something like 33-13 or something. Well, here's what's interesting. So the United Nations votes on the partition, and they came up with even some borders, some suggested borders and boundaries. And it was literally a partitioning. Like that area will be Jewish, that area will be Palestinian Arab, that area will be Jewish, that Arab. And then Jerusalem was going to be for no one. It was going to be an independent, internationally governed city. That was the United Nations proposal. So on May 14th, 1948, David Ben-Gurion got on the radio and announced to the world the formation of the State of Israel, we accept the United Nations partition plan, which included the internationalization of Jerusalem. We accept the plan. We accept the borders. We now declare ourselves a state based on those borders and that plan. The President of the United States at the time was Harry Truman. And Harry Truman had indicated, now he was a Christian, you might know, and believed in supporting Israel, although he also felt a tremendous pressure from the Soviets. So he's in a very difficult place, he believed. And so he nevertheless told his staff, I want the United States to be the first to recognize that Israel has become a state. So I don't care what time of day or night it is, you awaken me and alert me. I want to run down to the White House and make that statement. So they woke him up at like 5 in the morning, 4 or 5, and said, David Ben-Gurion's on the radio. He rushed down, made the statement, the United States is the first to declare that they recognize the state of Israel. Who was the number one? Who was number two? Soviet Union. Most interesting. For a period of time, they supported Israel. I'll tell you why that was. The reason that they supported Israel, because these kibbutz and kibbutzim were socialist. And they thought that perhaps then, that these socialist kibbutzim would then influence the Israeli government to become essentially communist. And so they were trying to win Israel to the side of communism. Of course, later, when they recognized that Israel actually was going to align themselves with the Western nations, then they reversed their support. But at this time, trying to win the Jews, they supported it. Now, let me ask you a question. What would have happened? What would have happened if, May 14th, 1948, David Ben-Gurion announces that Israel has become a state? What if the Arab people had said, we also accept the United Nations proposal. We accept also those boundaries, and we accept the internationalization of the city of Jerusalem. We declare ourselves to be a state also. Now, could they have done that? Yes. They absolutely could, because they had the same mandate and they had the same authority that the Jews did when they did make that declaration. They could have done it. What if they would have? I suggest to you that if they would have, we wouldn't be having this conversation, because there would be peace in the Middle East, but we presume. But it would have been the beginning of a Arab Palestinian state. But they rejected it outright, angrily rejected it, and declared, we will never have peace. We will destroy them, and we will push them into the sea. So, the very moment that declaration was made, 5 Arab nations and the Arabs of the Palestinian Arab territories declared war. They were already expecting that declaration because they had already been having a, quote, civil war and fights and skirmishes between them. And so the Arab nations had already been expecting such a thing and had already prepared their armies to advance immediately upon the declaration of that independence. Now, interestingly, at the same time, and this is where we lead to the Palestinian problem, those Arab nations wanted to minimize Arab casualties. And so they went to the Arab peoples and they said, clear out from the war zones and move into these temporary housing facilities, these tent camp areas. And they're not refugees at this point. They're just temporarily moving there, and they are told by the Arab leadership that this is only going to be necessary for a number of weeks or months. Because after all, it will be impossible for the Jewish Israeli state to survive. No one in their right mind thought it possible the Jews could survive. And so they told the refugees to clear the path so as to minimize Arab casualties. And once we've defeated Israel, then you can return, have your land, and you can have the land of your Jewish neighbor. So on that promise, many of them left. Now, as we know, the war began. And to everyone's surprise, Israel stands strong. Now, I mentioned this recently. We know that the hand of God and the favor of God is behind it. Unless the Lord is with the country, it will go nowhere. We believe we see the hand of God, the provision of God upon it. But how did God move? What were the specifics? How is that possible? And I suggest to you there were 2 major factors. Let's see, add a third one. 3 factors. The first is what I call superior motivation. They're fighting for their lives. Because the the Arab intent was annihilation. This is not just a war to defeat and control, annihilation. Another Holocaust. That was the intent of the Arab people. And so they have a superior motivation. Survival. And that is a pretty good motivation. Number 2, Czechoslovakia. So what does Czechoslovakia have to do with this thing? Well, it has everything to do with it because no nation would provide arms to Israel. None. Not the Soviet Union, even though at the time Soviets were for. No, they wouldn't. Not the United States. Not Britain. They're done. Not Germany. Not France. No one will provide arms to Israel, except for Czechoslovakia. Why? Why is their motivation? Here's the motivation of Czechoslovakia. Because they have been there themselves. They experienced losing their homeland. And therefore, they said, we're going to help these Jewish people. And they sent them tanks, they sent them rifles, they sent them ammunition, they sent them a worn-out, old, beat-up Air Force, but they sent it to them. Now, the Jews paid for it. They paid heavily for it. But they were thankful to have it. That's a second factor. Here's the third factor. The British blockade and the restrictions on immigration is now over. There's no longer a British blockade. There is no longer anyone stopping Jews from making aliyah. No one. So what's going to happen now? Oh, Jews from all over the world are coming. 10,000 a month. And these are now people who fought in the war, who are experienced fighters. Give me a rifle. Give me ammunition. I will fight. And so the ways of immigrants began to swell the ranks of the military. And they began to become stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger. And the Arabs they were uncoordinated. They would not organize themselves in fighting forces. But the Jews were well organized and fighting as a unit. And they were fighting for survival. And so to everyone's surprise, now they are advancing dramatically. By the way, when the Arabs declared war, was it for the purpose of establishing a Palestinian state? Was that their intent? Was that they're trying to do? No. They were trying to expand their own borders. Egypt wanted a bigger Egypt. Jordan wanted a bigger Jordan. Syria wanted a bigger Syria, and Lebanon. None of them wanted to create a Palestinian Arab state. Now, another thing happened. So now the Israeli army is a fighting machine. And let's say they come upon an Arab village. So they go to this Arab village and they offer them terms of peace. They go to this Arab village and say, we do not want to fight you. Please do not take up arms against us. If you do not fight us, then you will remain in Israel as welcomed citizens. You will have full rights as an Arab Israeli citizen. Please don't take up arms against us. And if that village did not take up arms, then they were welcomed and they were given citizenship rights. However, if that Arab village said, no, we reject your offer of peace, and in fact, welcome our incoming bullets, then the Jews would overtake the village and send them into the refugee camps. So were the Jews part of increasing the numbers of the refugees? Yes. Yes, they were. We must make sure that we're balanced in the narrative to make sure that we give the full of information. Yes, the Jews did add to the refugee numbers because they cannot have armed enemies within their borders. If you're going to take up arms against us, we're not just going to allow you to be citizens within our borders. We can't allow terrorists to be within our borders. We have to have safe borders. So you're going to be out. You're going to be on that side of the border. Now, this is all very important because there was another factor that happened. Let's say that Israel goes to Haifa, which this is a true story. They go to Haifa, and they surround Haifa. And very clearly now it's going to fall. It's going to fall into Jewish hands. So then the Arabs within it flee. Well, they want to flee. And so the Jews go to the Arab leadership and say, please don't flee. You have no reason to flee. We invite you to stay. We'll give you full rights. Become part of this society with us. We're going to build a country together. Don't flee. But the Arab leadership insisted, no, you must flee. Run in the face of the Jewish army. Flee. Get out of there. And here's why. What were the Arabs going to do if they won? They were going to annihilate the Jews. Therefore, the Arabs were convinced that if the Jews won, they would do the same thing to them. They expected the Jews to annihilate them. And so they would run in mass, sometimes 10,000 at a time, running in mass, thinking that the Jews would annihilate them. But the Jews tried to convince them, we have no intent of annihilating anyone. Please stay. You can be in these borders. But many of them fled, and therefore the numbers that ended up in refugee camps were something in the neighborhood of 700 to 800,000 refugees in various different camps: Lebanon, southern Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, in the West Bank, of course, and in Jordan, Gaza area, heavily concentrated areas. And many of them settling in the West Bank were left there. That was where they began. 1967, roll the tape forward, just kind of running through history, and we're going to have time for questions. Rolling the tape forward, 1967, you might be familiar with the Six-Day War. Okay, again, armies amassed on the border of Israel, and they made no qualms about stating their purpose. Massive armies. Egyptian, Syrian, Jordan, primarily. And so the Jews believed that if they did not take action, they would be annihilated. So they did a preemptive strike. And in fact, they destroyed the entire Egyptian Air Force in one day. Meanwhile, the Syrians withheld, and the Jordanians withheld. This was to the advantage of the Jews, because they could just take on Egypt by themselves. And after just destroying their Air Force, Jews essentially had their way. You must have an Air Force. If you know anything about war today, modern warfare, you must have an Air Force. And whoever runs the skies, whoever has control of the skies will win the war. And so Israel now has complete control of the skies and defeated Egypt. Syria entered the war then, although half-heartedly. Then Israel can concentrate on that. So in Egypt, they took the Sinai. Then in Syria, they took the Golan Heights and pushed them all the way off the Golan Heights. And then they had told the Jordanians, don't do it. Don't do it. This will not end well. Don't do it. And the Jordanian king he didn't want to do it. But misinformation had come. The Egyptian leadership lied. And they called the Jordanians and said, we have defeated the Jews. We have accomplished a great victory. Now it is your move. Move quickly, and you can partake and take all of it. Push them into the sea from the center, for we have defeated them. And so, based on that misinformation, they launched an attack onto Tel Aviv. That's how close they were. Tel Aviv is very near the coast. And the Jews essentially said, we warned you. And they came at them with everything they had, because they could now concentrate just on Jordanian army. And they pushed them all the way. Now, why did they not bring in the West Bank into Israel? Because they did not want that many enemies inside as citizens. No, we will control the security. They established a boundary of security. They control the borders of the West Bank and Gaza, but we don't want you as citizens, because you are already known to be our enemy. But they took the Golan Heights, that's over there by the Sea of Galilee, the upper area, the West Bank, all of Jerusalem, and the Sinai. Now, let me ask you a question. 1967, when Egypt and Jordan and Syria had decided to amass their armies, was it for the stated purpose of creating a Palestinian state? 1967, was that their stated purpose? No. Their purpose was to enlarge Egypt, to enlarge Jordan, and to enlarge Syria. It's never been their intent to create a Palestinian state. That's important. Now, here's another factor. After the 1967 war, the Jewish-Israeli parliament, known as the Knesset, voted unanimously to give it all back. This is a fascinating factoid. 100% to none. Give it all back. In exchange for the recognition of our right to exist and a promise of peace. To which the Arabs said, no way. No way. We will never negotiate. There will never be peace. And we will never take terms from you. Which then led to the 1973 war. And the 1973 war was a different war. There was a failure of the famous Jewish intelligence. Failure. One of the vast and rare failures. They were not prepared. And they were attacked. And the armies of the Arab nations advanced deep into Israel. Deep into Israel. And by all appearances, it looked like Israel was not going to survive it. Meanwhile, 1973, there was something very interesting happening in the United States. And if you know your history, you might know that Nixon was president of the United States. And Nixon, President Richard Nixon, was deeply in trouble. Watergate scandal. But at the same time, he was alerted because the Jewish leadership, Secretary of Defense, called Henry Kissinger, who was a Jew, by the way, and indicated a message from Israel. Our backs are against the wall. We are out of options. We have no more. We're out of tanks. We have no more ammunition. Our Air Force is being depleted. We do not have enough machinery of war to win. We will be forced to use our nuclear weapons. We apologize, but we have no choice. To which Richard Nixon said, in that case, send them everything we have. Send them everything we have. The Air Force leadership called and had a conference call. Well, which planes should we send? Because, we have some advanced technology now. Which planes should we send? I don't know if you know this, but Richard Nixon had a bit of a temper. And he lost his temper on the phone. And he began to cuss. And he said, I said, send them everything we have. And I mean every plane that you can get there. You send them everyone. Boom. Henry Kissinger said, Mr. President, the Soviets will not stand for this. Then he said, then you call the foreign minister of Russia, Soviet Union, you tell them, you entered this war, we will attack you with nuclear weapons, and I mean every word of it. They stayed out of it. Now, the Soviet Union was supplying the Arab nations, but they did not enter the war with their own soldiers. They had threatened to. But the President of the United States said, you bring your soldiers in, we're bringing our soldiers in. You bring tanks in, we're sending them everything in. And so there was the largest air shipment of military supply in the history of the world. Later, Golda Meir said, now this is an interesting fact, if it wasn't for Richard Nixon, there would not be a state of Israel today. Now, didn't you find that an interesting factoid? Later, Richard Nixon said, if I had not been in deep trouble with Watergate and already had committed myself to resigning, because what he said was, I got nothing to lose. What are they going to do to me? I'm already going to resign. I have no political fight to fight left. I don't care. What was interesting is that he famously recorded his own conversations. And some of the things he said were blatantly anti-Semitic. Later, they questioned him. You said so many anti-Semitic things, and yet you saved Israel. He said, I said those things. I didn't mean a word of those things. It was just the way people talk in those days. That's how people talked in those days. I didn't mean that. And I proved it, didn't I? Very fascinating bit of history. Today, there are, out of that 750, 800,000 original Palestinian refugees, today there's something like 2.4, 2.5 million. and not accepted and assimilated into the nations with them, not given citizenship. Well, in Jordan, they're allowed to have citizenship, passports, but otherwise not. Why not? Because it is more strategic to leave them there and to let the nations be against Israel, because it plays into their hand. And that Palestinian refugee problem will continue. And in fact, if you were watching the news about the recent uprising in Gaza, what was the stated purpose of these protests? To go back, it was said, to reclaim the land, the right to return. Now, at first you might think, well, that's reasonable. They want the right to return to, their farms or whatever they had before the 1948. Although 70 years later, it's hard to go back. But that's not what they said. No, we want the right to return to all of Palestine, which means the complete destruction of Israel. That is their stated intent. And the other day I was looking at a picture a journalist had taken of the protesters, and I saw a sign in the background, all of Palestine. It said, all of Palestine. That is what their purpose is, to destroy. Because they famously have stayed with this mantra, no negotiations, no peace, and no compromise. You can't negotiate with that. And later this summer, actually it's in early September, I'm going to have a second class, summer class, and this is going to be a video I'm going to show anyone interested. It's going to be a video of a Palestinian Arab Muslim journalist who is pro-Israel. And this I recorded, so it's me recording with my phone. So I'm not a professional, and I couldn't hold my hands up that long. But I'm going to play this because I think you will find it absolutely fascinating, because he puts forth the problem. Let me tell you the problem. The problem is what is happening in Palestinian Arab homes. If we're going to have peace in the Middle East, then the children must be prepared for peace. They must be told what peace will be and what it looks like, and they must be told to seek after peace and to desire peace. But this is not what they're told. In the Palestinian Arab homes, they're told to hate Israel, and that they're told that the greatest honor you'll ever have in your life is to kill a Jew. And so they're raised on hatred. And he said, you can never have peace with a people that are raising their children on hatred. And when a, quote, freedom fighter blows himself up in a bus station, and then the Palestinian government rewards that family with tremendous amount of monies for the rest of their lives, he said, you cannot solve this. So, and I forgot, I have it on another recording. If a Palestinian is arrested for like throwing rocks, then their family gets $50 a month. If a Palestinian is arrested for, shooting at a Jew, I'm just making these up because I don't remember the exact numbers, then he'll get, $100 a month, whatever. And it continues. If a Palestinian is arrested for killing a Jew, then he'll get, let's say, $250 a month. But if he blows himself up and kills many Jews, then his family will receive whatever, $500 a month or more, whatever. Where does this money come from? This money comes from the United States and other Western nations that support the Palestinian cause. And so now you might say, well, Pastor Rich, you seem kind of biased here. Well, first of all, let me say, I am. Because I believe that those who bless Israel will be blessed and those who curse Israel will be cursed. But I also say and suggest that I can summarize the Palestinian problem in one sentence. I can summarize the Palestinian problem in one sentence. One side wants the other side dead. And until that changes, there will never be peace. And so therefore, I support the side that is for peace. Because Israel will clearly say, we believe the answer to this problem is for the Palestinian Arabs to have their own state. We believe. That is what we want. We want to live at peace with our neighbors. We want them to have their own land. They can have the West Bank. They can have Gaza. They can have many of the territories. In fact, if you look at, and they're prepared. They've already got maps. The Arabs would get the majority of the land. But all we want is to be recognized that we have the right to exist and a commitment to live at peace, because we're ready to make that commitment. Would you just please acknowledge our right to exist and a commitment to peace, because we're ready to sign that. The Palestinians respond, no peace, no negotiations, and no compromise. So there is the Palestinian problem in brief. Okay, now we have just a few minutes, and I'm sorry that I did not leave you very much time for questions, but you have 4 minutes. So these better be good. Okay, sorry, I didn't mean that. Okay, I see your hand right there. And I'll try to repeat your question, so if you say it pretty loud, I will repeat it.
The Israeli Arabs have a vote in Israel, and it's a democracy. Is that correct?
Okay, so his question was, is it correct that the Arabs living inside of Israeli borders, is it true that they have citizen rights and a vote? Yes, that's absolutely correct.
I also understand they're increasing in numbers, so they're getting more and more votes. Do you think that's going to be a long-term threat politically?
He said that they are increasing in population, the Muslim Arab population is increasing in numbers and therefore increasing in percentage. Will that one day become a problem? At this point, I'm trying to remember what the numbers are. I think it's maybe less than 20%. So it's not a huge problem now. The Jews are making calls, you might say, inviting Jews to make a Liga. We need more Jews to come from around the world to counteract the birth rate of Arabs, so that they see it in the future. But at this point, it's only 20%.
Is that some of the reason why they don't want to bring in Golan Heights and stuff, because they have
Yeah, he said, is that why they don't want to bring in the Golan Heights and stuff, because they're concerned about bringing in more Arabs? Yes. Actually, they already have the Golan Heights. You might be referring to West Bank and Gaza. They gave Gaza away and to, the Palestinian Authority. They control the security fence, or the security border, and they have a blockade. They have no control with what happens inside. And they don't want to bring in the West Bank. They have control over it also, because they don't want to bring in that many voters. You're correct. Yeah, that's right. Go ahead.
You indicated early on that the Dome of the Rock was
A shrine.
controlled, yet the Israeli, I'm not sure if Muslim control, but Israeli.
Security. Okay, so let me repeat your question. Are you just asking me to clarify that? Okay. Explain how that works. So the question was, I made a point earlier that the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque sit on the Temple Mount. And that is controlled and given over to the Muslims, Arab Muslims. That's correct. But Israel controls the security. So in other words, they have control of the perimeter and they have control to the access. So if you're going to get up to the Temple Mount, you have to go through Jewish, Israeli security. And they reserve the right to prevent any Arab from going up there that they deem to be danger. Now, you might remember a year or two ago, the Israeli government put a metal detector. And it became an outrage. And it threatened tremendous violence. And so they ended up retracting and pulling the metal detector away. But that is an example of the fact that they control the access to it. And anytime they want to, they can just shut off. They can just say, you will not have access anymore. Now, that takes a risk because there could be an uprising against it. But if they believe that there's danger, And if there's an uprising that starts there, then they'll just shut it down. They have control of security, just like they've got control of security around the West Bank. And they got control of security around Gaza. They don't have control of security in the other refugee camps in Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. But those are the ones that control West Bank. When we say West Bank, do you know what we mean? We mean the West Bank of the Jordan River. So if you look at a map from Sea of Galilee, Dead Sea down here, the Jordan River connects them. The west would be over there. So the West Bank is there. And that's, much of it is surrounded by fence, security fence. And I actually have another recording of a colonel in the IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, who designed and built that security fence. If you remember back in the 90s, I think it was, there was so much bombings, terrorists blowing themselves up in buses and bus stations and such. So they decided we have to build a border fence. And it really, really stopped it. And of course, now what's interesting is many Palestinians who live in the West Bank work in Israel. And they have to cross over from the West Bank over to Jerusalem and other areas. So what do? They set up security areas. So in order to come through one way or the other way, you've got to pass through security. Now, one of the best ways to detect explosives is with a dog. But the problem was, you know how you see at airport security walking around with a dog, right? And they come and they're smelling and they're sniffing and they come up to you and they smell your carry-on and this and that. Are you offended when you see security with a dog? No, it doesn't offend you. You're saying, great, wonderful, it's a cute dog. And number two, they're doing their job. They're helping. I want this to be a secure flight. Thank you for the dog, right? However, the Palestinian Arabs are offended at the idea of a dog. And so the Jews have learned to not have dogs. But dogs are the best sniffers. They're the best detectors of such things. So they came up with the most ingenious method. So let's say the Palestinian is going to come to cross through. He goes through a chamber, and the air is sucked, vacuumed, and sent to another room where there's a dog. And the dog is smelling this air. And meanwhile, the Palestinian is vacuumed and has no knowledge or no visibility of a dog. Thus, he's not offended. So they're coming up with all kinds of creative ways of maintaining that security. And of course, it takes some time to get through, so they're trying to make it faster and faster. Anyway, that's a whole nother story. Okay, anyone else with a question? Go ahead. Right. Okay, he said, he's repeating me that during the 1890s, there were a lot of Jews that came to the United States. Why was that so, and why did not happen earlier, I think, right? So they were reacting to persecution. There was a tremendous rise of persecution in Eastern Europe. The Zionist Empire, the Tsars were not good people. And they were bringing heavy persecution against the Jews because they had to blame somebody rather than blame themselves for a failing empire. They had to blame the Jews. The Orthodox Church also blamed the Jews, and conspiracy theories and all kinds of lies came against them. And so in the face of such persecution, they fled. Many of them fled to the United States. But other places also, Palestine, Central America, other places. But the United States welcomed them at that time. Okay, great. Question, the very far back and then went up. Go ahead. Okay, so you were using as an example that you have a neighbor who knew that you had moved from California, and you felt, for whatever reason, he held that against you. And that became an example, like that didn't feel good. And so your question was, like, how do the Jews feel because the Arabs are basically committed to hate them. How do they feel about that? Is that what you're trying to say? Yeah, I think that the Jews, for many ways, they've grown accustomed to anti-Semitism. They understand that there is in the nature of many, many people an anti-Semitic vein. And so they've grown quite accustomed to that. And so they kind of figure out who is a friend and who isn't. And if you have decided you're a friend, welcome, my friend. But if you are declaring yourself to not be a friend, then we're going to be very careful about how we deal with you. So they're used to it. Of course, no one likes to be hated, but it's become a factor of life. They've grown accustomed to it, if that's a reasonable answer. Okay, right in front of him, go ahead. Okay, so his question was, at the end of all of that in the 47, 48 war, 49, there were about 750, 800,000 Palestinian refugees. How many of those were like pulled out or called out by the Arab nations? I think that was your question. And I'm not sure the exact number. I'm thinking somewhere in the neighborhood of 450, something like that. 1,000. Okay, any other questions? These are great questions. Right here.
One of the things, Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque outside of the original temple area?
The Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque sit on the Temple Mount. It's a flat area, and they sit right on top of it. So if you were to, for example, come down the Mount of Olives and look where Jesus looked, and he, of course, saw the temple which Herod the Great built, instead of seeing that temple, you would be seeing the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the temple and the Dome of the Rock. It was flattened by the Romans and thrown over the edge. And one of the places you go to is the southern steps, and just beyond that, you see many of the rocks where that was all thrown off. It's very fascinating because you can see some of the inscriptions. Okay, anyone else? Harry. Right. What he's saying was the current administration had stated that they were going to withhold funds to the Palestinian Authority if it was going to be used to be given to terrorist families. And so I think your question was,
do you think that's going to continue to go as a payment basis, or do you think they're going to actually withhold the funds? Or when you were over there, was there a discussion or
it was this, yeah, when I was over there, it was discussed, and I don't know what ended up happening to it. I hope that the administration held to that, because I am offended that our tax dollars are going for such a purpose. And I adamantly hope that that they're going to stick to their guns is not the right phrase, but you know what I mean. Okay, anybody else? Right there in the back. Yeah, right. And during the 70s, did Israel have nuclear capabilities? Yes, they did. And, they're very advanced technologically, and many of the Jews were actually on our team, including Einstein, in developing nuclear developing nuclear weapons, which we used in World War II. So that's, some 30 years later. 3 decades is quite a long time. So yeah, they had, all the way back then, and they've got many nuclear weapons today. Oh yeah, okay. Sure. This is important to understand because it has a lot to do with what Islam believes. And so let me just find it in my notes. This is in 620, so 620 AD, according to Muslim tradition, Muhammad flew, like, yeah, physically, well, I think they believe he physically went over there. What's that? Pegasus horse, I'm not sure about that. That's a good question. But all I know is they claim he flew to the Temple Mount, quote, the farthest mosque, which they believe would be on the Temple Mount, and returned on the same night. And that makes the Temple Mount holy to Islam. And therefore, the tolerance of the idea that Israel would build a temple there is unacceptable. World war would come of that. Now, is there the possibility, because I think I've said before when we went through the Revelation study, that I believe that the Antichrist, at least foreseeably, could, as part of the negotiations of this covenant of peace, could also include the negotiations to allow for the rebuilding of the temple. Now, there would have to be compromise on both sides, because the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock would not be moved. But there is an area just near it by which, with some compromise, it could be built near it. In fact, there's an interesting scripture that says in the book of Ezekiel that the holy and the profane will be next to each other with a wall dividing them. It's kind of an intriguing possibility. So I suggest that the Antichrist negotiates for the rebuilding of the temple, and then 3.5 years later reneges on that covenant, because I then would perceive that 3.5 years would be an ample amount of time to build it. So just as it's getting finished and being built, he takes it back, he betrays Israel, he reneges on his promises, and he sets up an image of himself in the Holy of Holies to be recognized and worshipped, you might say, because he creates a new religion. So that's kind of connecting the dots with prophecy. That's a great question. Okay, anybody else? I don't want to hold you. I know that we're running a little bit late over the stated time of our class, so if you have to leave, I don't take offense. But if you have any more questions, maybe we'll just take one more, two more. If you have any more questions, otherwise we'll go ahead and close. Feel free, no one's raising their hand, so I'm going to close. Feel free, however, to email me should you have any questions, and I'm happy to engage with you on that. My email is rich, R-I-C-H, at calvaryhillsboro.org. All right, I'll stay around if you have any more, if you want to talk personally about it for a little bit, that's fine. Thank you all for being here, and we're going to close in prayer. I appreciate all of your interest, a great turnout. Many people are watching online. Thank you all for tuning in that did that. We are going to have this recorded. Should anybody want to see it, it will be made available. I'll get you a link. We'll send that out. So that will be available for anyone who wants to see it again or review the tape of it. Also, I should mention that in September of next year, of 2019, I'll be leading a trip to Israel. If anyone is interested in going on that trip, you're welcome to join. Send me an email with your address on it, your email address. I'll put you in a queue. I'll put you in a database, and then as soon as I get it all worked out, price-wise, and the itinerary, I have the itinerary all worked out, but as soon as I have the pricing and all that, I'll send it to you. We'll be making announcements to the broader church come this fall, but just to put it in your mind, if anyone's interested in going to Israel, which I think you will find is tremendously rewarding. How many people in the room have been to Israel one time or another? A wonderful group. How many people would love to go to Israel someday? Yeah. And so I hope that you can come. And if you do come, I'm going to lead that trip. And I promise that I will be the main teacher. I say that because sometimes pastors rely on the guide too much. And I'm just a firm believer in doing my homework and knowing my stuff and bringing a spiritual element to your experience. So that's why I like to lead them. All right, let's go ahead and pray. Thank you all again for being here. Father, thank you so much for this gathering tonight, and those that are interested in what is happening in the Middle East and now understanding a little more. God, I pray that they would pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Pray for the peace of Israel. And I pray, Lord, that we would understand that your heart still resides there, even though that people has not named your name for many generations. I know, God, that you're not finished with Israel yet. And I just pray, Lord, that you would continue to press in on them. And I pray that the church would have such a relationship to you, the living God, that even Israel would be envious of that. And I just pray, Lord, that we as Christians would understand that your hand is upon the church in a powerful way. Help us to see what you've called us to be. And may we arise to that. We love you and thank you now in Jesus' name. And everyone said, hey, let's just give the Lord thanks and praise. Can we do that? Amen. Amen. All right. Thank you all again for being here. God bless you. Look forward to seeing you guys again soon.